Okay, welcome back. I hope that you had a good weekend. It's good to see you. We are moving right along. I know that many of you were able to complete and turn in the annotated bibliographies. So I will look through those and return feedback to you on those by the end of this week. But in general, from what I'm noticing, things are looking solid, and I appreciate you getting some of that work together. So this week, we are building on what we talked about so far in the class to look at space and place and the importance of locality and physical location in shaping how social change happens and how social movements can invoke those elements. So as we shift gears and we start to think about something like your social movement analysis essay, you might start to think about how space and place and location play a really big role in these movements. Even if they're happening online, right, there are ways that physicality and place are being invoked and referenced as you're looking through these movements and how they advocate on issues. Also, as I shared through Canvas, last week I chatted with Oregon Rural Action, and they are really excited about chance to present in class. So they will be presenting during one of our class meetings in November. They actually have a couple, 2 or 3 people who will be coming, including a couple farm workers who are involved in some of the activism related to the movement. They're going to be talking about some really cool stuff that they do. For instance, they were talking about how one of their major campaigns has been to host a weekly Spanish-speaking radio show to help reach farm workers of color in Eastern Oregon about health and COVID-19. And also a lot of social media initiatives about disparities in clean water. So I'm really excited. I will update you when I get an exact time from them on when they're coming in. We likely will have that in a larger room, and I'll be inviting people from outside of the class, so other EOU students to participate as well. So look forward to that and more information in the coming weeks as we start to get all of that together. I'm certainly excited. We spent some time last week talking about some of the ways that social movements and social change are happening online. There's a good chance if there's a social movement that you're interested in, right? Some or perhaps just about all of that movement is happening online, whether it's using social media, like hashtags, or using TikTok to get the message out there, right? We've seen that there's been way more online engagement. We've also especially seen this in the context of COVID-19 and switches to more online forms of engagement as well. And in many ways, challenging what we have traditionally thought of as a social movement. So again, a lot of these sort of readings and work that we have looked at has tried to understand elements of movements in different ways, that we can examine these 3 stages of inception, rhetorical crisis, and transformation, according to Griffin. We can understand some of the elements of protest serving the individual, right? But all of these approaches have generally approached social movements and social change as something like a text, right? And when we refer to the idea of a movement or social change being a text, what that means is that there is a tangible spoken or written thing that we can choose to analyze. For instance, if we're looking at the civil rights movement, maybe we're looking at the speech given by a major political leader or advocate within the civil rights movement, such as Malcolm X or Dr. King, right? Or maybe we are looking at the way that something like an environmental justice movement created something like a Green New Deal or environmental Bill of Rights, that there is something that is very clear as a piece of text that we can analyze. But when we start to think about place and space, when we start to think about bodies and the ways that bodies engage in activism, what we know is that defining a social movement in that way and understanding how social change happens effectively is covering so much more than that. So I think looking at those physical, embodied, the way that place and space are used and location is used to establish context are really important resources for us to understand. Following the annotated bibliography, I want to take a moment and have a shift gears to talk a little bit about the social movement analysis essay, and I'll take a quick second to talk about the final presentation in this class. And then we'll start to look For today at the Wanzer Serrano piece and the entries piece, and then we'll look at the Crick chapter on Wednesday's class. So I want to take some time to talk about the social movement analysis essay. So that is your next major assignment coming up. So this week we have just a standard Canvas prompt. This is my other class, sorry about that. So this week we have the third Canvas prompt that's coming up that's just connected to these readings. Again, I recognize that for you all, some of these readings can be a little bit, I don't know that they're always written the best. Sometimes it can be a little bit jargon heavy. So one thing that I really recommend folks to continue to do is maybe to look through the prompt first that covers the main important points, and then look through the reading, kind of trying to identify those points that align with that pretty well. So we'll be looking through these readings and working through this. One thing that I wanted to highlight just to put on your radar for the schedule for next week is that we'll have our meeting next Monday, but we do not have an in-class meeting on Wednesday, October 26th. So not this coming Wednesday, but the following Wednesday. And what I will be asking you to do for that week's prompt is instead of doing a reading that I assign, I have put together a list of some of the chapters that we're not able to get to in this class from the Crick textbook. And what I'll be asking you to do is to choose a chapter that you're especially interested in, or one that kind of resonates with the topic that you want to explore, or just one that you want to learn a little bit more about. And I'll ask you to work on that. So that list there is attached and just goes over the different ones that you can choose from. So I recommend giving them a little bit of a look, figuring out which one you're interested in pursuing, and that'll be for what we'll be doing next Wednesday in lieu of coming to class. And then on Friday, November 4th, that is when the social movement analysis essay is due. I originally had that listed as November 2nd, that Wednesday, but I wanted to give you some extra time. So November 4th is the social movement analysis essay. So we've been doing some activities and brainstorming in this class about social movements that you might be interested in or wanting to explore in more detail. So you could choose one of the social movements that you've been working on for some of the class activities or for your annotated bibliography. But if you've decided that I want to go in a different direction, or there's a movement that stands out to me, or I didn't really like this topic once I got into it, you're welcome to choose a different topic for the actual essay. So one thing that you can do is draw from the sources in your annotated bibliography. You don't have to include the annotations for the essay, but the annotated bibliography could help you out if there are sources that you want to draw from in the essay that are in. So the social movement analysis essay is asking you to take an example of social movement that is exposing unequal distributions of power, right? That's what social movements are generally doing. And specifically to analyze what communication that social movement is using. When I have looked at these assignments in the past, the papers that look really good are the ones that generally are choosing some theories or ideas from the class that really have a good fit, or that you see as really resonating and connecting to that idea. So for instance, maybe you're interested in understanding space and place, and as we'll talk about today, the idea of intersectional rhetoric. Maybe you're looking at a social movement such as Black Lives Matter, and you're really interested in the ways that this movement is using both visual as well as image and textual components, and using all of those things together. Great, that intersectional rhetoric is a great framework to draw from, right? Or maybe you're interested in a movement that is very focused on social media, and maybe a couple of the pieces on social media you find to be especially good choices, like the use of Twitter in the piece talking about use of Black Lives Matter following Eric Garner, right? So you might be interested in whatever approach or relevant reading might connect to your topic. So it can be the same or different than the annotated bibliography. 3 to 4 pages, and that would be 3 to 4 pages of the content of the essay. So it'd be outside of a title or outside of your citations, right? The floor is hard, the 3 pages. You definitely get at least 3 pages of content given the things that you need to cover. But if it does end up being more than pages, for more than 4 pages, and you've got more content that you really want to make sure to include, you can definitely make it a little bit longer, you know? So double space, standard font margins. So one way to think about this one, right, is that, as you know, essays will have typically an introduction and conclusion, and then some body points. If you think about the 3 main body points that you would spend about a paragraph or 2 each talking about, these would be identifying the major social movement and how it's relevant to underrepresented populations, whether it is people of color advocating for rights, whether it's advocating for missing and murdered Indigenous women, whether it is advocating for environmental change or regulation, right? What is the movement? What is it advocating for? Second of all, and this is the really big part, right? Identifying what communication strategies the movement is using, right? What is it doing to communicate? How is it communicating and advocating about this issue? And then finally, I want you to use an assessment to consider what you see as effective or impactful about this communication. Is this movement working? Is it successful? Is it unsuccessful? Is it persuasive? Is it unpersuasive? Using the ideas we've talked about what makes social movements work, you can think about the elements that you really find to be a good fit or not good. So I'm asking you to use at least 3 outside sources. So these could be articles or chapters that we've talked about either in the textbook or linked through Canvas. They could also be some of the outside scholarly or academic articles, including ones that you have incorporated into your annotated bibliography. But I also recommend including perhaps a source or 2 that is tangibly related to the movement itself or helps us to show or understand the movement, right? So if the movement involves some type of speech or advocacy, what are people saying? What are people chanting? What picket signs or flags or things are they holding up? What things are being said in the speech? Or if you're using something like a hashtag or online campaign, right? What are some quotes or examples of things that they're doing online? So providing information and kind of tangibly showing us a part of the movement in your analysis, I think is something that will really help to make your analysis and so on really focused. The sources, again, can be from your annotated bibliography, but they're not limited to it. And you don't need to actually paste or include the annotations in this assignment. So again, I think that choosing an idea or theory or approach that you feel like is a really good way to analyze your movement is a really strong approach for this assignment. For instance, maybe you're looking at a campaign that uses narratives and storytelling. Cool, we have the Occupy Homes article for that one, right? Have an approach that provides a bit of a backbone for the content that you're looking for. So the rubric is based on a few different parts, right? The first is that you're able to, in this part A, identify the social movement. So are you clearly explaining what this movement is, why it's relevant to the experiences of underrepresented populations, right? Making sure that you're able to define and explain what about this makes it a movement in the context of our class is important. So doing so early on is helpful. If you find yourself with a bit of an edge case, you're not really sure if this fits under a movement or not, just reach out to me and I'm happy to help you with that, right? I encourage you to help to get the right scope for it, because if you say, I'm going to focus on the civil rights movement, or I'm going to focus on Black Lives Matter, that's very big, right? I encourage you to think about a part or component or piece of that movement, right? And if you're choosing a smaller movement, right, if you're looking at a specific advocacy, for instance, on a college campus, right, like providing something like, healthy food at Berkeley, right? You might be wanting to ensure that there's enough information about that movement and what's going on that you can draw from. As we'll be talking about today, it's difficult when you're analyzing a movement and there's only so much within that movement that is recorded for posterity, right? A lot of what happens in a movement is difficult to recollect and difficult to tangibly return to. If you wanted to be really ambitious, if there was a rally or event or some type of movement that you're very serious and involved in, and you wanted to participate in that or observe it and report on that, that would work too. So I'll open that option up to you as well, knowing that, of course, out here in Eastern Oregon, there might be, on average, fewer opportunities to do that, even though they exist. So can you identify the communication strategies of this movement, right? That's the next part. Connecting those strategies to elements of social change communication that we've talked about in class. So for instance, right, the use of narrative. You might talk about the use of pentad and how a narrative is created and designed, and look at a social movement that uses it, right? Social movement evaluation. Are you making a judgment here, right? And considering to what degree is this movement effective, persuasive, or not, based on what we've talked about. So the identification piece is the biggest part of your score of identifying and analyzing what that movement is doing. And then lastly, organization and conventions, right? I recommend the 24-hour rule, print out or like export your document at least the day before it's due, give yourself a day away, come back to it with a fresh pair of eyes, and you'll notice some convention issues to fix that you probably didn't know first. So just make sure that it's clean and easy to follow. Again, not due until well over 2 weeks from now on November 4th, but I did want to give you a sense of what to expect on this assignment, what I'm looking for, and so on. I know it's not the most exciting to go over, but I do like to be as clear as possible about this one. Any questions? Yes.
I just read the term you mentioned about we could submit and turn in analysis as, for example, like to students with feedback.
Yep, absolutely. Whether it's for this or for the Canvas prompts or any other written assignments, you are welcome to send me a draft or an outline early, and I will turn around and do that for you. Generally, at least 2 days before the assignment is due, right? So November 2nd, the Wednesday, would be the ideal time to turn that into me so that I can return feedback for you that you have enough time to meaningfully use. But yes, you can certainly send it to me early if you would like feedback and want to know how you're doing. Good question. So that's going to be coming up during week 6. And then the last thing, I had a couple questions about this. So we'll be talking about this at the end of the term, but the last week of class, December 5th and 7th, that'll be the opportunity for you to essentially design your own social movement on an issue or topic that you're really interested in, and be talking about ways that and present to the class essentially what your movement does and how your movement would work. So I recommend continuing to think about topics you're interested in and like to. Okay. Any other questions before we get rolling? Great. Okay. So space and place is an area that has really been kind of new in studying communication and studying social change, right? I think that we think about location sometimes, but we don't think about location as a really central and important part of how we make arguments, right? If, for instance, we think about a lot of famous speeches, or we think about politicians or leaders who are giving speeches at locations, right? The usage of physicality and usage of that location has always been an area of discussion, right? You think about, for instance, presidential inaugurations, and there being a lot of discussion and debate about how large the crowds were, right? That's an example of how the elements of space really play a big role in what we see as persuasive. If there's a large audience, right, it has an impact, but also how place is invoked. You know, when somebody is speaking at the state capitol, right, or somebody is protesting out the state capitol, that is a choice, right? And it's a very deliberate approach given the significance of the location, its relationship to political leaders, and so on. if we think, for instance, about several years ago on Wall Street, right, there was the statue of the bull, right, and the bull kind of symbolizing capitalism and corporate influence and sort of the corporate culture of Wall Street. And you might recall that there was the bronze statue of a young girl who was standing and kind of standing straight at that bull, right? How we're using place to shape or reshape meaning of those locations to change, what it means for a bronze bull to be there versus somebody standing and kind of confronting that bull. Well, that changes the meaning completely of that place. So I think understanding those approaches, understanding that place itself shapes our arguments is a really useful thing for us to look at. So we'll be starting with work by Dr. Darrell Wanzer-Serrano. His name has changed, like last name has changed a little bit. So I think that you'll see a couple references to Wanzer, and then it has another last name hyphenated instead of Serrano, but same person. So this piece is looking at intersectional rhetoric, right? And what intersectional rhetoric does and how it can help us understand it, right? The Endries and Senda Cook reading. So this is a cool one. Dr. Danielle Endries was a professor of environmental communication at my grad program at the University of Utah. Did a lot of really cool work. Does a lot of work on the rhetoric of nuclear colonialism and nuclear dumping. And really interested in understanding locality and physicality as part of the argument. And then on Friday, we'll be looking at, or on Wednesday, we'll be looking at the Crick chapter that gets into occupation of space and part of the confrontation component of that as well. So I think a really good place to start here is with the Wanzer-Serrano piece called Trashing the System. This is kind of a fun one if you're reading through it and just kind of visualizing what all is going on here, but also one that, of course, is incredibly important to these communities. So the time is 1969. It's in East Harlem in New York City. And within this section of the city, we had a group of working class Puerto Rican Americans who did everything that they could, in their jobs, worked hard to survive. However, the challenge that their community had faced is that the city sanitation department, where they would pick up your garbage bags and take out your bins and clean things up when you take out the garbage, right? The city sanitation department was literally not going to their community. They did not drive into or pick up any of the garbage. So they'd leave the garbage out and never get picked up. It never received the service that other parts of the city did. And so an organization was formed called the Young Lords Organization, or the YLO. And the YLO was developed to respond to and essentially protest and spotlight that the needs of their community, including literally picking up garbage, were not being addressed at the city level. And while garbage on its own, of course, would have an important impact on a community, that having this accumulation of garbage, of course, would be a problem, what this group was able to do was to speak to a broader argument about how this community was framed, discussed, and talked about, and aim to use this movement to address this. And not only did the Young Lords protest and identify the use of garbage as a problem, but the way that they used garbage was especially unique in that they occupied intersections and blocked traffic by stacking garbage on the intersections. Garbage that was not being taken out because garbage people wouldn't come to their communities, right? So not only is there use of protest and the use of a verbal argument, but there's also the way that the garbage itself is being used and invoked to make the argument about place. So wanted to share a short clip about the garbage offensive and about some of the work that the Young Lords have been doing.
This show is a look back at the Young Lords, radical group founded by Puerto Ricans modeled on the Black Panther Party in late July of 1969. The group staged their first action in Mexico City, New York, to increase garbage pickups in East Harlem. The Young Lords would go on to inspire activists around the country as they occupied churches and hospitals in an attempt to open the spaces to community projects. The group called for self-determination for all Puerto Ricans, for independence, for the island of Puerto Rico, for the control of institutions and lands, freedom for all political prisoners, and the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam, Puerto Rico, and other areas. The Young Lords would also play a pivotal role in spreading awareness of Puerto Rican culture and history. While the group disintegrated by the mid-1970s, its impact is still felt today.
The Young Lords is the focus of a new art exhibit that's organized by the Bronx Museum of the Arts called Presente, the Young Lords in New York. It's on view at 3 different cultural institutions here in New York. Tonight, our very own Juan Gonzalez, who served as the group's first Minister of Education, will host the first in a series of programs hosted by the King Juan Carlos Center at New York University.
So kind of understanding the history and context of this group, right? So the Young Lords were originally developed as a set of people who were picking up trash, and they came from backgrounds where they were dressed in work clothing. And so you just had average people who were picking up trash early on. And the juxtaposition of being dressed for work while picking up trash was kind of part of the argument. They were beginning to highlight that this is something we have to do because this is not being addressed by our city. However, over time, members of the YLO started to listen to and understand the concerns of members of their community. As they went around and interviewed and chatted with people in their community, they started to notice were people saying that the garbage was pervasive, right? The garbage was smelly, it was everywhere. It was hard to focus, it was hard to get things done, right? Because of it just being this ever-present phenomenon. So it started to emerge as an issue impacting this community. And then after this, they started to block the intersections with trash and very visually display the trash to highlight the lack of support that they received. And things actually escalated to the extent that they started lighting some of the trash on fire, right, to really show and highlight some of the issues here. So this escalation of physicality, the invocation of trash here, is a really big part of the argument and the rhetoric that is being used. And so this connects to the core idea of intersectional rhetoric, which again could be an approach that you might consider incorporating for your essay. So Darrell Wanzer Serrano lays out the idea of intersectional rhetoric as one that suggests that there are multiple rhetorical forms. So again, we think back to available means of persuasion, right? Rhetoric is about how we're using communication to influence other people. Speech, the usage of verbal or written speech. Embodiment, our ability to be physically present. We think back to the idea of body rhetoric, right? It's how we use the physical body to convey or speak to an issue, right? Somebody has tape over their mouth, right? If somebody is wearing the red dress, right? That is the use of embodiment and image. So Kevin DeLuca puts forward the idea of an image event, right? Or an iconic image, an image that's captured and represented. It really visually shows and captures the movement for us. So again, a really good example of civil disobedience and peaceful protest is the single man that's standing in front of the tank at Tiananmen Square, right? That's a famous iconic image. But the usage of imagery that is circulated, shared online, shared through video, right? Those elements are really important too. So in other words, intersectional rhetoric is about the crisscrossing of these different parts. It's saying that these different elements that shape the movement are all important, that you cannot understand these three without understanding them together. And also this idea that intersectional rhetoric is not leader-centered. Oftentimes when we think about movements, right, we think about civil rights leaders, or we think about founders or major proponents, right? We think about folks like Greta Thunberg, but even in a contemporary context, we have a lot of leaders and people who might be involved or play a big role. They are not the only ones, right? The movement is more than that single person. And sometimes you have divisions within a movement that diverge from that leader too. So it's not leader-centric, and it draws from a number of conventions, right, that are political or reform. In other words, the practices that it's doing, the tactics that movement is doing, it's not just one thing, it's a combination of different elements that shape the persuasive goals that they're trying to reach, right? So again, if we think about historically how we studied and looked at a lot of movements, well, it was dead white men writing about how nice the speaking and writing of other dead white men was, right? So we have moved beyond that, and we've moved toward understanding that the body, the physicality, all of those elements together really need to play a big role. If all we did was look at the young lords and say, this is what they said in their speech, or this is what they said when they were marching, well, that's ignoring the very physical, unique, and surprising elements of their movement, right? Physically blocking an intersection with garbage, forcing us to visually see the garbage impacting their community. That's a powerful image, and that says a lot more than a speech could cover. So understanding the movement means understanding those parts. So intersectional rhetoric, this is kind of a visual way to describe and think about it, right? The intersectional rhetoric is this crisscross or intersection of different things. So in other words, the Young Lords Garbage Offensive was an intersection of the written and spoken pieces, right, with their advocacy, white papers, and those elements of the movement were. It is embodiment, right, in the way that physicality is being invoked, and the use of imagery, and the striking imagery with garbage pieces, right? The collision of those things, the intersection of those things helps to define movement. It's also important to recognize that intersectional rhetoric, as it's being described here, is a little bit different than the idea of intersectionality. How many folks have heard of or are familiar with intersectionality as a theory concept? Yeah, so a few of you, right? So intersectionality comes from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. It's the idea that drawing from Black legal studies, right, and the experiences of Black women in the legal system, that the experiences and injustices that Black women face are categorically distinct than the experiences that white women or Black men face in the legal system, right? So the idea that intersectionality is recognizing the multiple overlapping axes of oppression that impact populations. So intersectionality as a concept is different than this idea of intersectional rhetoric. So they're a little bit different in the ideas that they're trying to get across, but both invoke the idea that we have these crisscrossing of experiences that are shaping how we understand the movement more broadly. So what I'd like to do is take some time to have 3 different groups who will explore some of the different elements of the Young Lords Garbage Offensive. And you're welcome either to look at some time in the article itself, or to look at just the way that it's being circulated or talked about on the internet, right? You can take some time to look at that as well. And I'd like you to take some time in groups to share, first of all, how was this element of the movement present in the Garbage Offensive? How does this element add to the intersectional nature of the movement? And then take some time in your groups to think about another social movement that might also fit this idea of it being intersectional and having these kind of crisscrossing multiple paths. So why don't we have why don't we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 focus on the written or spoken element of the Garbage Offensive? Why don't we have the 1, 2, 3, and 4 focus on the usage of embodiment, right? So a body being present at that space. And then we'll have 1, 2, 3, and 4 focus on the use of image and imagery, Okay, so there's probably going to be some overlap between image and embodiment, but do try to figure out that part of that movement. So take some time to chat in your groups about this element of the movement, either from the reading or some work that you're finding online. What this adds to intersectionality as a movement, and another social movement you might see as fitting this bill as well. So take some time to share and talk about this, and then we'll chat about this together.
Oh my. Okay, this is very
Do you read that?
Sorry.
right.
So.
I don't know if this might but it's like there's also like
So do they change?
Sounds like groups are transitioning into the third part. So let's take about 5 more minutes in your groups on this.
Yeah.
So take another couple minutes and have somebody who will be able to share. Okay. So let's take some time to talk about this and break down this reading a little bit together and some of the things that happened in the garbage and pencil. So let's start by talking about the elements and the sort of parts of this movement that, when we take it together, help this to intersect. So let's start here with the first group that was talking more about kind of the written and spoken elements. What were the things that kind of stood out in what you were able to uncover?
Definitely like the signs that were held up during the marches and stuff. For the protest. And then we also found that it was like written, because it started kind of a political campaign. And it was written in one of the articles, like the dirty streets are the third campaign.
Wow.
So that's how it was communicated.
Right. So we have both the use of signs, right, of protest, of activism that's happening at the time, but also in the ways that it's being talked about, right? And we're thinking about history. Well, history is spoken, it's written, it's using text to make sense of that. So when we see press and media that are talking about this story, right, it's adding to that component. How about the embodied group? What were some of the things that you noticed as you were working through this?
So we said that basically, so it was kind of like hard to break down, like.
Yeah, sure.
embodiment.
Mhm.
But so we said that they embodied the movement by using their actions. And so their actions were putting garbage in the street and street sweeping. And symbolism of the trash helped push the idea that not only were the trash being neglected, the community was being neglected
Yes.
as well. And their basic human needs were also being neglected.
Yeah. Yeah. So I really appreciate you hitting on that, Kiana, because the embodied element, right? Part of the argument is that the community not being heard and understood is this accumulation of garbage, right? That this community is neglected, that it is decaying, that it is not receiving the support, right? The garbage is a way to visually represent that and to really put on display those elements, right? When we think about garbage, especially a lot of like economically privileged households, I mean, garbage, you throw it in the bin, you get rid of it, you have your non-reusable plastic and it's gone, right? It's out of your head. You don't have to face or deal with it. But the idea here that garbage is something that is now front and center and is something that people have to reckon and deal with, right? Because it's what people living in East Harlem had to deal with regularly themselves. It's really kind of highlighting that part of the argument. What about the use of image or imagery here?
And then trash was a metaphor to describe the experiences of the community.
Yeah. Right. So in this way, the presence, the way that the garbage was visually shown, circulated through, headlines, articles, photographs, all of those things really helped us to see that as well. So when we think about this, right, I think you all have already started to get to that part too of what it adds to the intersectionality of the movement, because you see the presence of the written, you see the presence of the ways that bodies are being used to do street sweeping or to stack up the garbage. And you see the way that the imagery, the sheer accumulation there really plays a role as well to describe and visually represent that experience. And then what about other examples of movements that have an intersectional component? What were some of the examples that you all were able to highlight? Maybe starting here again with this group on the side.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Oh, what was another movement or example that you found that was speaking to those intersecting components?
We talked about we missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And we just kind of shape that as like the written stuff would be papers and posters, but you can see words on images could be like the hanging of the red dresses. By themselves, and the embodiment could be individuals wearing red or even.
So there's the use of the signs information, there's the use of the dresses. I remember when those were on campus last year, we were on some of the trees last year. And there was another component you identified as well. What was that?
Like red pigment on the mouth.
Yeah. Right. So there is the signs and that material that is spoken and written. It's providing the context. There's the use of dresses that we could be seeing as really kind of imagery based, right? It's a very stark image when it's blowing in the wind. The usage of a red handprint could be the use of the bodily component too, right? So there's definitely those elements at play. How about here in the back?
We think that just software. Blown up. Due to video being posted of people doing soup on events at the day. This is to the up. And it is basically a movement against fossil fuel production. And so we kind of honestly need all three just in this protest that they did recently.
Yeah.
And so I would say that this, initially they used more of an embodiment in image. So embodiment could basically superpose themselves.
Wow.
So they did that, and then the image part they threw a can of tomatoes on the Vincent Van Gogh painting, basically stating that like you guys are here like caring more about art and there's like bigger issues going on around the world. And then their speech after they had done these actions, they typical speech to protest and talk about the movement and educate others.
Yeah. I really like the way that we see each of these elements of the movement as complementing, right? Like oftentimes the use of embodiment, right, is this like very stark, like, whoa, it's getting our attention, right? They are throwing the soup or they're super gluing themselves to the wall, right? Like there is something that is getting our attention. And then oftentimes once we're hooked, we're like, well, what are they talking about? What is this about? What are they interested in, right? And then we have those more speech or textual components. So I think a strategy a lot of movements can use effectively is having this almost shock value or visceral impact of the visual or embodied aspect that can then draw attention to the argument or the spoken or written component, right? Because if you are trying to write a paragraph about your advocacy in the sea of the internet, it can be very difficult for that to gain traction in a lot of times. How about here on this group?
It shows social equity, race, and mental factors that make it growth.
Yeah, right. So you know, we've seen the sort of use of the hashtag, the very textual elements, but also the use of physical occupation and embodiment, the use of imagery. When I was in Salt Lake City, on the west side of the city, right, they were building murals that had George Floyd and a few other figures there, right? So how we represent or memorialize or portray through imagery can play a really big role here too. I wanted to show a fun video that is another example that helps us to crystallize some of these elements of movements too. This is the one. So this is a kind of satirical advertisement that I think is another example of how some of those intersectional components of rhetoric, especially in things like environmental communication, are used effectively.
Here at Lad Bible, we've come to a decision. We're going to start our own country. Seems a bit ridiculous. Well, it's about to. There's been a huge mucking issue growing over the last 20 years that everyone has conveniently taken a blind eye to. Plastic waste. 8 million tons of plastic get dumped into our oceans every year. There is so much of it within the North Pacific. There is now an area of trash the size of France. With no one doing anything about this countryside problem, we thought we would by turning it into an official one. So welcome to the trash aisle. We teamed up with the Plastic Ocean Foundation, and on World Ocean Day, we submitted the Declaration of Independence to the United Nations to seek recognition of the trash aisle as an official country. If we can make this country by the UN Environment Charter, which states all members shall cooperate in global partnership to conserve, protect, and restore the health and integrity of the Earth's ecosystem, which is essentially by becoming a country, others are obliged to clean it up. We only have 4 criteria we need to hit for the UN to recognize the trash aisle. We need to be able to define authority. Check. Form a government. Check. Be capable of interacting with others. Check. And lastly, we need which is where you lot step in. Your signatures on our petition will help force the UN to approve our application. Become a citizen of the trash aisle today.
So it's silly and it's satirical, right? But it's also incorporating these elements of intersectional rhetoric that we've talked about, right? This is like an actual campaign that nonprofits and organizations have tried to help put together, which is there is such an accumulation of garbage and waste that why don't we legally declare it a sovereign nation so that then the UN is legally required to clean it up, right? And again, we see this example of intersectional rhetoric in the arguments about plastic waste and the ways that dumping of waste have impacted our ecosystem and environment, but we're also seeing the usage of embodiment, right, being physically present or there as a member of that nation, but also the use of imagery, the accumulation of garbage and waste, and that collection of waste being used to highlight the challenges environmentally as well. So there's a lot of work like this one that could be satirical, that can invoke specific things like the language of sovereignty or of being a nation, right? That are also incorporating these elements of intersectional rhetoric. So as you're thinking about which topics you're interested in as a social movement, think about this holistically, right? Think about how the different parts of the movement are coming together, and how if you only focus on the speaking, or you only focus on the embodiment, or only focus on those elements, that thinking about it whole scale really lets us see the depth of what the movement is doing and what the argument that movement is trying to make looks like. So let's take a break. We will continue around like 2:09, 2:10 or so, and pick up talking a little bit more about the Endries and Send a Cook reading and elements of space and place.
I don't know. No, what you think? I think that's right. So we do. No, I don't No. Hello? Oh. I can't read that. I don't need to make responses. That's stressful on my end. We can do this without. Don't read it like that. Just read it. Do that? Wait. Oh, if I was feeling you. No, right. Oh. Wait, let me just write it. Oh. It's thank you so much. Sounds good. Well, kind of going off now, but it was really good. Maybe 2 weeks ago. I think I should just put up. I can put it. How do you keep it here? No, I used to say stop. I think it was the last time I got it. I think it was not, but I only paid the same. I didn't read that off. Wow. Yeah. I don't know. What do you do? Oh, partially you or the boys that come out. Other things. It's cool because like I think it's the only one you can just like make part of the club. You should give them to each other. Oh, true. Spoken with the words of truth. It's almost. It's almost. Oh. She also probably should take it. Oh yeah. Also her. Oh, that's probably. Business. Yes. One of these people are so warm. Send you there for a while.
Okay, so let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the Andreessen Cook reading. So place and space are two terms that I think we use a lot, somewhat interchangeably, but I do want to help us understand the difference between those two and also to understand why these two things matter and can be useful as we're thinking about how to effectively advocate for social change. right? When we look at a lot of successful historical movements, or even when we think about contemporary movements that involve things like marches, like protests, like demonstrations, there are strategic decisions that are being made about where these are being held, right? These are being held in locations based on what is attracting people, right? But also the idea that the location itself brings about a unique part of the argument or a point that we don't really see elsewhere. And that as we're trying to study and understand social movements, that the usage of physical place plays a really big role here. And in particular, that the very idea or notion of place is not a static thing. That place and the meaning that we assign to place drastically changes. Again, if we think back to Occupy Wall Street, right? Zuccotti Park was just a park, right? But the occupation of that space over time to protest bank bailouts and practices is just something that completely changed and in many ways overrode the meaning. When you see something like a march or demonstration or protest, right, that meaning of that place in that moment becomes overwritten, but also implicated by that meaning. I'll give you an example. My mom lives just south of Seattle, and I was driving by on the way to see her about a month or two ago. And as I was driving by, there were several teachers who were on strike and were waving their signs to support better pay and compensation for teachers, right? And that was located right outside the school, right? School, of course, being a place for learning, for camaraderie, for building, careers and skills. But in that moment, the location of the school mattered, but that location was being implicated and changed by the presence of that strike, right? It was the summertime, and so the teachers were giving this new meaning to this school as a place of highlighting inequities in pay and compensation and support for teachers. So when we're thinking about place and space, they are both overriding or impacting, but also being impacted by where that's happening. So one of the examples that is cited in this Andreessen send a quick reading that unfortunately does not have a video or other better visual to indicate it. I tried to find it. If you're interested in environmental movements and environmental movements surrounding areas like breast cancer in particular, I definitely recommend the Phaedra Pizzulo piece that is talking about the Toxic Links Coalition. So you might be familiar with, of course, National Breast Cancer Awareness Month, with the pink ribbons, with the pink bands, right? With a lot of research and development and efforts that are being made to raise awareness about and provide support for people with breast cancer. And in fact, a lot of organizations, right, will use pink lighting or pink coloration in order to indicate their support, right? So National Breast Cancer Awareness Month and its organizational structure is very much about highlighting, this issue. However, there is a group that has emerged called the Toxic Links Coalition that used a practice that was called toxic tourism. It's referenced in Andrew's piece, in which members of this group would do a tour in which they showed people some of the waste sites and facilities that National Breast Cancer Awareness used to highlight the ways that this movement in its manufacturing and building of materials was actually contributing to toxic waste and environmental factors that would heighten the risk of breast cancer, right? So essentially, the toxic tour was a strategy of highlighting the ways that the manufacturing and practices of National Breast Cancer Awareness Month in certain aspects could exacerbate the problems of breast cancer, and we're highlighting steps that the organization could take to better address and deal with these issues, right? So the kind of juxtaposition between National Breast Cancer Awareness Month and the Toxic Links Coalition response to and usage of place to highlight the problems that this movement's practices might entail is an example of how place and space play a really important role in shaping the arguments that we make. So place is going to be the bigger emphasis here. Place are locations that are semi-bounded, right? So they have some level of definition to them. But what they have are what are known as material and symbolic qualities. If we think about something like the Oregon State Capitol in Salem, right? We think about the idea that it is bounded, right? It's got a geography to it, has a building structure, but it is also symbolic, right? That it is representative of the state, what we might consider to be the strengths or shortcomings of the state legislature, the governor, the leadership of that state, right? That would be fitting under how we think about place. And then it's embodied, right? That it is experience, that people go into it, that people can be there, right? And experience that. Place is something that is constantly changing. So how we define a place and the significance of that place is something that over time we come to develop. I'll give you a really good example, right? The place of EOU's campus a couple of years ago was very different than what it looks like right now with COVID-19 and a lot of the ways that courses were being taught completely remotely, right? It was much more of a ghost town after during that period of time. So place is constantly changing based on presence, based on meaning, based on understanding. Space is different in that it's a more general category about how practice is regulated by spatial thinking. In other words, I like to think about space as being a little bit more like the Google Maps explanation of where things are, right? What is technically on the EOU campus. It's not necessarily looking at the meaning and symbolism, but it's saying this is a location, right? So space is general. Space refers oftentimes geographically to something, right? So space might be saying this is the Columbia River. Place would be saying the Columbia River has incredible symbolic and spiritual and religious value to many of the confederated tribes of the region, right? So place is highlighting the significance and importance of these locations. In other words, right, movements that involve some element of physicality, of protest, of engagement are invoking place. Place is important. Place helps us to understand context and significance of those areas, right? That if we're looking at, the California labor movement in March in 1966, well, it was significant that they went from Delano to Sacramento, right? They were going to the capital city and they were going through many of the farm neighborhoods and communities that were most significantly impacted by poor working conditions and wages for farm workers of color, right? So the idea here being that where this was happening, the context is incredibly important. So with this, right, place brings about some unique challenges. Place is what we might come to know as something that we can't easily refer back to after the fact. If you have ever been involved in something like, a march or a protest or a rally or any type of activity, right? There is a feeling or experience that you get being involved and being there and participating that just doesn't translate. It's a feeling of solidarity with other people that are there. It's a feeling of being a part of something, right? There's this feeling of involvement that is not something that you can translate as easily for posterity, right? It's something that can be lost. I am sure there's a lot of movements and activism that have happened, communication that has invoked change, but we can't be there at that time. It's been interesting seeing the development of VR, which has tried to help create more immersive and interactive experiences. So there's developments in how we might imagine ourselves in that place in that time, but there's always something that's lost, right? Place is an interaction with bodies. That is, place is where we and other human beings relate and see one another, right? We see each other holding up signs or demonstrating or participating, and we feel a sense of community through people engaging with each other. The CRIC chapter that we'll be looking at on Wednesday gets into those elements as well, where after the occupation of the bridge in Memphis, right, people started to break off, but nevertheless were doing things that were indicating this feeling of support and interaction. For example, right, there were some protesters who were knocking over garbage cans, and others who, once they saw that, were putting the garbage cans back up to keep things from looking violent in any capacity. In place also means that to understand what's going on, we can participate through observation or ethnographic work. So there's some really cool stuff. Professor Aaron Thornburg over in anthropology and sociology does some really cool work about ethnography, right? Ethnography is when you go into a culture or group and you study and take field notes, right? You observe on what that culture or group or movement is doing and report on those findings. Right? Observing, participating, and being involved is one way that we can understand and engage with movements. And over the last few years, we have seen a shift in how we understand and study communication to do much more of that type of work, right? That reading texts and reading activity online, yeah, that tells us some things, but being there and being involved and understanding what's going on, that does a lot too, right? Not to say that there aren't movements that are exclusively online that are making a big difference, right? But that there are also tools in our toolbox about how to understand communication that's happening at these sites by being involved at these sites, right? That there are things that we learn from our participation. One of the projects that I'm doing is looking at the rhetoric of sensory inclusive spaces and how going to those spaces is an important part of trying to understand how they work and the arguments that those spaces are trying to make. So how many folks here know what this island is on the right? So this is Alcatraz, right? So you might be familiar with that story, that being a prison, but you might be less familiar with the indigenous occupation of Alcatraz and the movement that was created through that occupation. So I'm gonna, in just a minute, share a little bit about this and just context that I think is useful here. So there are two categories that this reading lays out that help us to understand why place plays a really big role in understanding communication and social change. One of them is this idea of place-based arguments. And I think that's one that's a little bit more straightforward, that the place, right, is used as part of the argument. So those of you that are interested in examining any types of movements that use like climate or environmental activism, there's a very good chance that you're going to see place-based arguments there, right? For instance, if there is a community that has seen like wildfires, right, and it's burned down, and you have somebody that is addressing and speaking to environmental justice, with that backdrop, right, that is a place-based argument that is using the place as part of making the argument. Or the trash aisles video you just saw, right, is using the place that has literally been created as a result of our waste, right, as the argument. Look how much trash there is. We can make a sovereign nation out of it. Place as rhetoric is a tricky one. This is the idea that the aspects of the place, the elements of that place, right, have significance, meaning, and consequence. In other words, that the elements of the place, right, are using, supporting, and are intertwined with the argument that you're trying to make. In other words, oftentimes something like a state capitol building is a common space in which people protest. Why? Well, because you have state legislators who are participating in like meetings, they're voting, they're walking through the halls, they're going to see it and they're going to hear that protest, right? So it's a part of the strategy for somebody to be at that place and be making their arguments at that place to reach their audience. So that's an element of that, right? That the aspects of that place play a really big role in what persuasion or rhetoric is happening. So, you think about how, for instance, something that has historical significance, again, whether it's a Capitol building, whether it's, Wall Street, whether it's a park, right? The meaning of those places is shaping what assumptions and ideas that we have about that place. One of the things that the reading highlights is that there was a movement that was at a park, right? But the idea of this park having this very kind of leisurely, recreational connotation, oh, you know, people listen to music, people do barbecues or whatever, was overriding the ability of place to be used to make the argument, right? Oftentimes what we associate as meaning with a place can make it more challenging for place to effectively convey the point that it's trying to get across, right? Where is this argument happening? Where are people making their points, and how is the use of physicality impacting that process? So I'll show you this short clip here.
Welcome back to CBS Saturday Morning. This year marks the first time an American president has proclaimed an official Indigenous Peoples Day observance. Activists have sought to use Columbus Day to refocus on Indigenous communities. On Monday, Native American and environmental activists protested outside the White House, demanding the government take greater action on climate change. This demonstration comes 50 years after the end of another protest led by Native Americans on the site of one of America's most notorious prisons. Sunrise over San Francisco Bay and the morning of prayer brought 1,500 Native Americans from 574 tribes this week to what has become sacred ground. Alcatraz, once called the harshest federal penitentiary in U.S. history, also ignited a movement. On November 20th, 1969, protesters took over the Rock Island, declaring it native land, citing the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, which gave Native Americans rights to abandon federal property. There was no water, heat, or power, just empty prison cells and crumbling buildings. Young people, you don't get cold because, we come from reservations and communities where we don't have a lot of things and a lot of conveniences. Lenana Warjack brought fellow Native American students from Berkeley. Richard Oakes, who planned the occupation, led classmates from San Francisco State. 89 of us that landed on the island, we did give protest of the broken treaty, the poor policy, the fact that they had denied us our culture and our heritage.
This was a huge declaration, a huge statement.
University of Kansas professor Kent Lancet has written extensively about the takeover.
This was a massive media event. It was staged theater. The Rock is kind of like our March on Washington. It's kind of like our I Have a Dream speech in regards to creating a greater Indigenous future.
So the occupation of Alcatraz, right, was a way in which place was fundamentally changed and reinvented. That there was this meaning of this island, that it was, a notorious, well-known prison, right? And suddenly became this occupation to talk about Indigenous land rights, Indigenous treaty violations. The place, the significance that we attach to that fundamentally changed. If you ever go to do a tour or visit at Alcatraz, you can still see some of the graffiti, spray paint, and signs from the Indigenous activists and protesters talking about, saying things such as, "This is our land," right? So this has been used to fundamentally change what that place is. So whenever you go to visit and again do a tour, right, you're not just seeing the context of it as a prison, you're seeing the context of this occupation and this protest as well. They're now intertwined, and our understanding of place is fundamentally different. My master's advisor did a lot of work about the rhetoric of memorials and memorialization of things like national parks and monuments and things too, and has written a piece about this as well. So in this way, right, place is able to do three unique and important things. Social movements can build off of pre-existing meaning of a place. So if you go to something like Capitol Hill, right, or you go to a state legislature office or building and you're protesting at that building, right? Well, you're building on the meaning of that place being one in which legislatures accomplish tasks. They have things on the docket, right? They get policies done. right? So you're building off of the meaning. This is a place in which leaders get things completed. You have movements that temporarily reconstruct new meaning to a place. So this idea here that reconstructing Alcatraz as a site of indigenous protest and acknowledgement of land was an example here of that as well. And then the repeated reconstructions to create new meaning to a place. Place is a performance, it's a constant doing. So if there, for instance, is an annual event or vigil or space that is being used over and over again, right? That's attaching that meaning over time. That place starts to develop and become sticky when it's being used on a regular basis to create new meaning and understanding. So what I'd like you to do is take some time in your groups to take a look at, toward the end of the Andreessen Senda Cook reading, her mentions of Step It Up, which was a campaign based in Salt Lake City over some of the environmental movement in Liberty Park. And I'd like you to identify some of the ways that this movement was using place and take some time to chat about whether you see the strategies that it uses as effective. So this is brought up toward the end of the reading. Take some time to explore this, talk a little bit about this, and then we'll chat about some of these ideas together. So this comes up starting at 271. So it talks a little bit about Step It Up, and it has some photos as well talking about this one. Yeah, this is, so you can leave just like a couple notes. It doesn't need to be extensive. We'll mostly be talking about this. First name is good.
My emails are always professional.
That's reasonable. Very reasonable. So let's talk together just a little bit about this. I know some things still to unpack, but I think we can continue to kind of look at this together to understand what all is going on. So I lived in Salt Lake City for 5 years, went to Liberty Park a few times to give you a visual sense of where it's located, right? It's this very kind of large rectangular park that's in the middle of the city. And one thing that I think is useful to know as you're reading through this article and the argument that's trying to be made, right, is that this park is very segmented, right? So you have the pond, you have this little gazebo area up here. So it's difficult in a context of a movement to understand what's happening, right? If there are so many different activities and meetings that are going on in this place that can make the persuasive argument that Step It Up is trying to do a little bit difficult. So let's talk about place as rhetoric. What is place as rhetoric in this context? How was it used? Is there a group that would like to take a stab at that one?
So
Yeah.
this was earlier was the pre-existing meeting, the temporary reconstruction. And so I guess that was in Washington Square Park. So the pre-existing meeting was that it was a place for local government, and the temporary reconstruction was kind of reconstructing it as a place where festivals were held.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Oh, no, we didn't get to the.
Oh, I got it. Yeah, we can. So that gets us at a good starting point, right? Where this campaign is using places rhetoric because it's trying to invoke, either Washington Square Park or Liberty Park as, a location in which things happen, right? And legislation is made, but also using a place-based argument. As you probably noticed in the article, right, they talked about trying to make it like Woodstock, trying to make it this event where they have things like bounce houses and various activities that are available as well, right? So they're trying to create this sense of community and camaraderie. But one thing that you might have noticed in your group, or that you might notice as you're continuing to work through this article, is the broader argument that this strategy was not as effective, because the dominant reading of something like a park is that it's a place of recreation, of fun. If you see people in a bounce house, you think, oh, this isn't advocating for environmental change. This is just a fun activity or event, right? So one of the challenges that we can continue to think about is, how are people reading or understanding the place in which this activism or this change is happening? So the reading or the narrative or the framing of that location, well, that's important to understand what's being made here. So it's an area to continue to explore and to think about as we look at the significance of space and place overall. So to wrap up the main ideas for today, we looked at these two readings to understand, first of all, Juan Serrano's idea of intersectional rhetoric. This is really useful if you're examining a movement that has these visual and textual and imagery-based components together, and you really want to look at the confluence of those factors. You can even look at social movements or social media as an example of an intersection there. We talked a little bit about space and place and how arguments are being invoked in discussing place as well. So we'll continue that discussion on Wednesday, looking at the CRIC chapter, talking about the bridge occupation. So please either email or send me the work your group did today with your names on it. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and we will touch base again on Wednesday.